Warning! Tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, we're going to dive straight into the build on this amp this episode, and I'm going to go over what we did since the last one. So I showed you about this fold over and solder on these tag strips. So I'm not going to revisit that, but I'm going to show you where we've put them all. So we have this little short guy over here, and we've soldered the two heater wires for the 6.3 volt to the lower holes in this tag strip. Looks like that. Then here's our 3-terminal ground bus, or our star ground point, that's up here on this back transformer nut underneath it, and we've scraped off the metal underneath it so we get a good ground connection. Over here we have this 5-terminal strip that we cut one of the lugs off of the end of it that looks like, let me zoom in here to show these tag strips and what they look like. So that one looks like this. Then on the output tubes, we have this 5-terminal and this 5-terminal. As you can see, we're not going to use this terminal at all. And we've done the same thing on the input tube. We have the 5-terminal strip with the center one folded over. We're not using it at all. And then finally, we have these two long ones that are tied down on this end by the screw on the tube socket. And there's 4 terminals here for us to use. So the layout we're going to use, we have, this is the second cap in the power supply, and it's bolted down to this bolt on the front choke. And there's a nut underneath here on this one, because it's really hard to form this clamp where it's not crushing the cap without doing that. And so there's a longer bolt here with a nut. This clamp is a 22 millimeter diameter clamp with a nut on top of it. This is a 35 millimeter clamp, and it works fine like this with just a short bolt with a nut holding this clamp down. So you don't need to double nut this one. So in the last episode, we wired up the rectifier tube, and I'm not sure if we wired up the power switch yet, but power switch wiring, basically you use the normally open contacts. Make sure the switch is on the fuse side of the IC connector, which is this upper one. So transformer, black lead, really doesn't matter, but I just do the black lead, hooks up to the hot here, and then the fuse side goes up to the switch, comes back, and then we have some heat shrink tubing here with it connected to the white wire. And I do like doing this connection kind of out here in the open and not up underneath this metal thing, just to ensure that over time there's not like some vibration or, friction or whatever rubs through this and causes a short. I also love this Permatex liquid electrical tape, this stuff, and I put it over these 110 volt connections before I put the heat shrink tubing on it and let it dry. And then I also kind of slather it. Let me show you what this looks like. I also slather it all over the back of this IEC connector and also this ground so that it can't corrode in the future. It kind of seals up that connection. And then you can see here too, we've pulled the center tap for the high voltage and also the center tap for the heater over to our star ground point to get ready for that connection. So the next thing that I like to do is get the heater wires run. And the heaters are going to be a twisted pair of 18 gauge solid core wire that comes off this connection. It's going to run across here. It's going to go to these 2 pins, and then it's going to come off of these 2 pins around this front side, rolls across here, comes up to the second tube's heater, and then it will daisy chain off of here, down, up to our front end tube, and I've bent these pins over like this. Then I've put a little small piece of wire between pin 4 and 5, and so that the heater will hook up to here on one side and there on the other, and come across the top of the tube and then come down this way. And we're doing that to keep it away from these pins as far as we can, especially the grid, which is this pin and this pin, so we don't pick up heater noise into this front end tube. The other thing that we've added to this amp from the original design, the first one I built just had a rectifier tube with the 22F Soling cap that's going to sit right in here, and it had this 220 UF cap with the choke, which are these two wires right here. So these choke wires, one of them is going to come up here and hook up to pin 8 on this tube. Again, the keyway is facing back, so this is pins 2 and 8. So pin 8 is the output of the rectifier, goes to the choke. The other lead from the choke is going to come up here to this terminal on the tag strip, and that's going to be the high voltage DC out of the choke. And it will have been first filtered by this 22 UF reservoir capacitor. So initially, this was the only other cap I had in the power supply, this 220 UF. But I've decided to add this 100 UF 500 volt cap as the second cap in the power supply, and then we're going to add this 50 ohm power resistor, and then have this 220 UF as the final filtering cap. So we're adding an RC, or resistive capacitive filtering network, as the final stage. So we're going to solder this resistor here going into the lower hole in this terminal of the tag strip, and going to move it over about this position here where it's closer to this vent up here that goes through the top of the chassis. And then we're going to run another piece of heavy gauge wire from this lower hole here and loop around and come to the top of this resistor. And the point of using this really heavy gauge wire is to give it a little bit of physical strength so it doesn't like just sag down from having a flexible stranded wire or something like that. We're using this, basically it's a piece out of a Romex house wiring, 14 gauge solid copper, and going to do the same thing over here. And then we're going to mount it down with a piece of this thermal double stick tape. And so this double stick tape is thermally conductive, and it will mount this to the chassis so the heat can transfer through the top of the chassis. And it's also going to be close to this vent hole, and we'll put some holes in the bottom of the chassis that allow the air to flow across this and out this vent hole to help keep the heat away from these capacitors as much as possible, because that's the last thing you want, is these capacitors to get a bunch of heat on them. And so we're moving this like as far away from these caps as we can, and there's going to be some caps over here as well, so we don't want to, have it close to there. So we're putting it out here kind of by its lonesome, double stick taping it down, and then run some wires. So let me get this guy mounted down, and I'm going to go ahead and get these heater wires laid out and show you what that looks like. Okay, so here's what I've done so far. And I'm going to zoom in here and just kind of scroll the amp around so you can get a better view of what's really going on here. Okay, over in this corner, we've got the two choke leads. One of them comes up here to this terminal on this side. And then as you can see, we have some 14 gauge solid core. This is just house Romex type wire. Run over here to this side of this resistor. It's intentionally put over here by itself. It's stuck down to the chassis with some double stick thermal transfer tape, and then got another wire coming over here to this terminal right here, which is going to end up being our final B plus filtered voltage that goes to the rest of the amplifier. So again, we have the first stage is this 22 UF Solene film cap, which has turned out to be part of the magic of why this amp sounds so good. These Solene caps used as the first reservoir cap in the power supply really gives the amp some clean, strong bass response versus some of the other caps that I've experimented with. And I know there's those people out there that say, yeah, it's a cap, it doesn't really matter. Guys, this one makes a difference in the way the amp sounds. So don't try like a WEMA or even an electrolytic cap doesn't work as well in this position. And there's something about these Solene fast caps that work really good with a tube rectified power supply as the first cap. And the other side of it's hooked up over here to our star ground point, where we have the center tap for the high voltage and the center tap for the heater, all tied to the same tag strip point. And like I showed you in the previous video, all three of these are tied together. Then the metal's sanded down and it's bolted down to the chassis right here in the back of the amp using one of the power transformer hold down screws. So we've got that installed, and this is a 40 millimeter clamp. And make sure that you work with it with your hand and get it round so it doesn't crush this cap. Get it where it's just gently holding the cap. And it may take a little while and playing around with it, but you can bend these where they're perfectly round, and when the two sides are clamped together, it's just barely clamping this cap, and it's not going to crush it. If you crush this cap, you'll kill it and it'll short out and it'll blow the rectifier tube. Also note, this was the longer stud with a nut underneath and then a nut on the top, and that spaces this clamp a little bit off of the chassis to give us a little bit of room like that. So make sure you mount it like that as well. And this gives you a good view of the 6.3 volt heaters. I've soldered them down here in this lower hole coming from the transformer, and then put the wires going to the heater in the upper holes. But you can put them all in the upper hole if you want to. It's not a huge deal. And then I think you can see here, we're putting this 14 gauge Romex into these lower holes of this tag strip here. And one of the things to note about building amps like this, they're kind of done in layers. And this is going to be like the lower layer of this wiring over here in the power supply. And then some of these other wires from these caps are going to be going over the top of these. So it's important that you solder this stuff up in this order. I learned from a mistake building this amp multiple times on the best order to lay this wiring out. And that's why I'm showing it to you like this. Is if you do it in this order, it'll make things a lot easier to connect. So the next thing you want to do is the heater wiring, and it comes from here, goes down, and this needs to be up against this metal, or needs to be down as close as you can. You don't want this floating up in the air. You want it down, up against the chassis, and that helps shield it from the other wires that are going to be crossing over higher. So this comes over, comes up, goes first on the lower pin of pins 2, 7, and then on the top pins, this other wire comes off daisy chaining. And you can see how those crisscross as they go across. Now you may see this black stuff and you're like, what happened? Well, I accidentally touched the soldering iron to this insulation and kind of roasted it a little bit. So I came in with the liquid electrical tape and touched up where I burned through the insulation a little bit. That's going to happen, guys, when you're working on these, and that's another reason to keep some of that liquid electrical tape handy, because I would have had to go on, whoops, I touched the soldering iron to this when I was working on this wire, and so now I got to tear all this out and just start over. You don't need to do that. Just put a little dab of that liquid electrical tape on where you might have burned the insulation and just keep going. just make sure that like these wires aren't laying up against each other. And it really wouldn't even matter if it had any insulation on it. But just a little safety precaution, and it's a good way to keep from having to just start over if you make a little tiny mistake. So then we come over here, these same two pins, 2, 7, are the heaters. Again, we went in the bottom, then we did the top for the part that daisy chains up here to the front. If you notice, these two wires kind of come underneath this white wire, and I found out laying it out like that makes this where they, crisscross and look really nice, and it just kind of flows well. So you can do it however you want. You could actually have this just all on top of there if you wanted to, but I just like to keep this as compact and as tight as possible so it keeps this twisted pair of high current, low voltage AC away from any signal wires like this plate and screen wires that are going to be coming over here. And this is the grid over here. And so we're keeping the grid as far away from these heaters as we can. And that's why we're kind of wrapping them around the back side here. And again, those are the keyways. We also tied pins 1 and 8 together on both sides, but they're reversed. So this outboard pin is the one we're going to be connecting to. It's important to connect pin 1 and 8 when you're using EL34 tubes because there's no internal connection. Let me see if I lift this up a little bit so you can see where I did pins 1 and 8 together on both of those tubes. And then we'll go up here to the front end, and again, as we tied pins 4 and 5 together with this little jumper here that's probably hard to see, but it's there. And then cut off the length of this pin that we don't need. And then the heater comes in from the underside on this pin. And then this white wire wraps over and goes over the top of the tube, or which is the bottom of the tube really, and connects to pin 9 there. And then we have our plate, grid, and cathode, plate, grid, and cathode. And we'll go over all these connections here in a little bit. So the next thing we're going to do is, in our scheme of doing this layering thing, we're going to do the ground connections to the front end too. And so, get this up a little bit so you can get a little better light here. So the ground is going to go from the lower hole in this terminal, loops a little bit, comes around to the lower hole in this terminal, and then it's going to go from here across to our remote ground point, which is going to be this terminal on the tag strip, and we're going to have it come across and go into the lower hole on this tag strip. Then at the same time, we're going to go ahead and do the grounding for the power tube area, and we're going to be running a wire from this terminal here on the end. It's going to come across here and then down, and it's going to go into this lower hole on this tag strip. We're going to have a wire that goes again from the lower hole in this tag strip across to the lower hole on this tag strip. Now before we solder all that up, we're going to go ahead and run the ground wires up to these tag strips. It's going to be this terminal right here. We're going to run a wire from here, kind of loops around and goes into the bottom of this tag strip. And then the same thing here, we're going to have one that goes from the bottom hole in this one, and there's going to be 3 wires going into this hole here. It might be kind of a tight fit, but they will fit. And then it loops around and comes over to the top hole in this tag strip. And we want to keep it away from this heater if we can. So we're going to kind of go up and loop like that up in the air over this heater wire. and we're going to cross it at 90 degrees. If you're going to be crossing any kind of heater wires, you want to make sure you're doing it at 90 degrees. So the next step is going to be getting all these grounds kind of connected, and that's going to create like the basement floor of all of our wiring that's going to be, close to the chassis. The other stuff's going to be up a little higher and going to be kind of crisscrossing some of this stuff. So let's get that grounding all connected, and that will complete kind of the base floor or the base of this whole amp design. And then we can come in and do things like finish wiring up these capacitors and get this power supply finalized. So let me get ready to do that grounding work, and this is probably a great place to just wrap up this video. And I know some of this stuff is going to look like I'm being redundant or going over things multiple times or doing the same thing multiple times, and I'm just trying to make it very clear for you new guys that want to build this amp where exactly each wire goes and try to show you in detail. The other thing you may see is I am using different output transformers than the other video that I started the series with. I was using the ISO Tango iron, and I went ahead and finished that amp up for a customer. And so this one we're building with the EL34 iron that has these flying leads, and it's really not any different depending on which one you're going to use. Just instead of having the little turrets here, you've got these flying leads that come to these grommets. And I always go ahead, and one of the first things I do is connect up the output transformer output leads to these speaker terminals just to kind of get them out of my way. And then connect the red positive lead to this terminal on the very end, and then this terminal on the very end, just to kind of get them out of my way as well. And then I kind of hold these across the tubes and leave an inch or two past the tubes just to give us a little extra room. And then cut these off because they were like way out here somewhere. They're super long, and I cut them about even with this tag strip. Just they're going to be going to these tube pins, and that gives me plenty of room to loop them up, but then it makes them short enough where I can just kind of tuck them up here out of the way and they're not in my way while I'm trying to work on other parts of the amp. And you can just kind of stick them in there like that. So anyway, hope you're enjoying this series. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. I am going to be publishing the schematic and the BOM soon. I've decided this is the final version. Listen to this amp enough. I know this schematic is what I'm going to be going with. I know I've waited a little while to make sure that everything's working like I hoped, and it is. So we're ready to publish all that. Hopefully be doing that later this week. Thanks again for all you folks that are giving me your support. And until the next video, have a nice day.